liked by Hitler because he was giving very pessimistic evaluations of the chances for success on the Eastern Front. And Hitler thought that he was exaggerating the number of troops and all this, so Hitler told Gehlen and all of his intelligence officers that from now on, he only wanted the good news. He didn't want to be told the bad news. He only wanted to be told about the defeats, not about the victories. And the book, The Occult Right, goes into this. Their theory is that Hitler was a magician and he needed a positive atmosphere in order to work his magic. But whatever the case, Reinhard Gehlen at that time formed an organization called the Society for the Prevention of Criminal Stupidity. And it's not entirely a secret society because I've read one reference to it in a book about Gehlen, and that's how I happen to know that it exists. I believe that if the truth about the Kennedy assassination, the whole truth, is ever discovered, you will find at the heart of that assassination General Reinhard Gehlen's Society for the Prevention of Criminal Stupidity. I think they decided that John F. Kennedy was criminally stupid. I think they decided Lee Harvey Oswald was criminally stupid. I think they decided Jack Ruby was criminally stupid. And I think that with good reason they decided that I was criminally stupid. And recently there was a movie about Jack Ruby that I thought, a lot of people thought it was cornball. I thought it was at least as good as the Oliver Stone movie, which I liked very much. And in one scene in that movie was particularly relevant to me because one of the problems I have to deal with a lot of times is people say, Kerry, your theories are so bizarre. You know, what is this Society for the Prevention of Criminal Stupidity? Is that, you know, this stuff is bizarre. And it doesn't seem to occur to them that political reality itself is bizarre beyond all imagining. And Ruby says in this movie to his friend, who is a mafia hitman, he says, I've been dealing with the CIA lately and I've figured out what their game is. He says, they act so kooky that if you tell anybody about your experiences with them, they'll think you're crazy. And that's true. And this is a very well-known form of camouflage in the intelligence community. And they even have a slang term for it. They call it nutty flavor. And people do not look at nuts. People do not look at cranks who write little weird right-wing letters and so on and so forth, as much as they look at people who look like they know what they're doing. So it's a very good form of camouflage. Back in 1977, when I was just encountering some of the really bizarre stuff they do with technology, that you would think I was crazy if I told you about some of it, because it is just incredible. There were technological things that Nikola Tesla came up with that had no commercial application, that Morgan and George Westinghouse, both of whom were friends of his, and Alice Chalmers put into operation for political purposes. The wireless transmission of electronic current is one of them. You can transmit current wirelessly. There's no commercial application because anybody can get a receiver and get all the current they want for no price, because there's no way to put a meter on it. Anybody can make a receiver to get the current that's being broadcast, so they don't use it except in politics. Anyway, I was telling my brother about a lot of this stuff, some of it which was happening to me personally at the time, and he gave me a very sympathetic look. And he said, Kerry, insanity runs in our family. And I briefly scanned our family tree, and nobody in our family has ever been anything but monotonously normal, with possibly the exception of myself. And so I said to him, name one person in our family who's crazy, or who's ever been crazy. And he did. He named one. He named himself. He said that when he was a kid, because he was the only one in our immediate family who had blue eyes, he thought he was an alien from outer space. And then he told me about how in Los Angeles in 1967, this was after he'd taken about 300 acid trips, one day he was standing across the street from a Burger King, and the people were walking out of it with their arms and legs sticking out of weird places in their body, like they'd been shuffled while they were eating hamburgers or something. Well, you know, hell, weird things happen in Southern California. So anyway, Richard is an attorney. He passed the bar exam. He decided to take up legal research instead of courtroom law. I think that's a good thing. I can just imagine him saying, Your Honor, my client is not guilty by reason of insanity because he picked me for an attorney, and I'm crazy as a balloon, and no sane man would have done that. A few years ago, I started getting these very angry letters from a reader of my Zenarchy stories, An Inside Joke. And this guy told me that not only was I schizophrenic, and sounded like he knew what he was talking about, even to me, but also that I didn't understand Zen. Well, my mission in life is not to understand Zen. I'm here to explain Zen. Last year, some of you may know, my kidneys quit working. I wound up in Grady Memorial Hospital. Well, the doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. They said, we don't know how long you're going to live. I thought to myself, well, hell, I've never known how long I was going to live. I didn't need doctors to tell me that. And then I got to thinking, this is a good time to die. You know, the Idle Warriors has just been published. In the introduction, my introduction to the Idle Warriors, I mentioned my manuscript about my nonfiction manuscript about the Kennedy assassination. So there's no way they'll be able to suppress that because I've distributed lots of copies of the manuscript over the years, and now it's mentioned in print. And you know, Janis Joplin, Jesus Christ, Lenny Bruce, all these people picked the right time to die, and that's why everybody remembers them. So I really reconciled myself to the idea. Oh, by the way, they also tested me for AIDS, and that was a surprise to me because I passed. I hadn't even studied. And so I'm going to send out postcards to all my friends that said, you know, the good news is I'm HIV negative, the bad news is I've got 2 weeks to live. And then, unfortunately, things took a turn for the worse. My health improved. And I was really bummed out. You know, I said, you know, all my problems were solved. People have been picking on me for years. You know, it was going to all be over, and now, you know, now I've got to go back and deal with all this stuff again. What if I don't take dialysis? What if I refuse to take dialysis? Then can I die? And they said, would you mind talking to the shrinks? I said, oh, sure, I've got nothing to hide. I'll talk to the psychiatrist. So 3 or 4 psychiatrists interviewed me, and they asked me if I had ever tried to commit suicide. And I answered them truthfully. I said yes. So once, when I found out I was a subject of a mind control experiment, and they said, Mr. Thornley, you're the subject of a mind control experiment? And I said, well, among other things you probably wouldn't believe. And they said, very interesting. You know, and I said, oh, no, wait a minute, Doc. You don't understand. I know this sounds paranoid. I said, I'm quoted 4 times in the Warren Report. You know, I'm a Kennedy assassination witness. And I said that to one of the social workers at Grady. She says, what's the Warren Report, a magazine? And then I realized that these people that I was dealing with were very young. They weren't even sperms getting on the mark for the big race when Kennedy was assassinated. And they had no idea what I was talking about. The Oliver Stone movie hadn't come out yet. And it was like they were just looking at me like, oh, whatever this guy's babbling about, he's obviously incoherent. And so they asked me if I would be willing to stay in a psychiatric ward to be observed for a period of time. And I said, well, you don't understand. I said, my credibility is very important to me, and if it got out that I'd been in a psychiatric ward at Grady Hospital for whatever reason, that would shoot a hole in my credibility completely. So they gave me the benefit of the doubt anyway on the basis of 2 or 3 very superficial interviews. They decided that I was paranoid schizophrenic. And I discovered this one day when I was down in dialysis, and I happened to have my hospital records in my lap. They were being transferred with me from one room to another, and I opened them up, and I found these 2 reports in there claiming that I was experiencing delusions of persecution and was paranoid schizophrenic and suicidal, and so on, which I was suicidal in a sense. Not only were there 2 different reports saying essentially the same thing, but there were extra copies of both of them, so I smuggled them out of the hospital. So now, if I ever kill anybody, I can always prove that I was insane. I'm legally insane now, I guess. Anyway, my kidney doctor, the gist of all this was that I was a poor, in their words, their exact words, I was a poor prospect, or a poor, how do they phrase it, a poor candidate for rehabilitation. And they were referring to my kidneys, not to my mental state. And this was because they were afraid I wouldn't take my medicine and that I wouldn't stick to the prescribed diet and all this. And and the kidney doctor told me that I'd be on dialysis for at least 6 months, probably for the rest of my life. In 5 months, I was taken off dialysis. My doctor termed my recovery miraculous. There was, in fact, however, one of the medicines that they gave me that I stopped taking. Kidney patients quite often develop, for some reason, overacid stomach conditions, and they were giving me aluminum hydroxide because the pure aluminum hydroxide doesn't have any sodium in it. And when you don't have kidneys, your body can't handle sodium. And I decided it was making me senile, because I'd go to the elevator in the hospital and I'd stand there and say, all right, for about a minute I'd be looking up or down, you know, which one do I want? And finally I'd figure it out and I'd push it, and then I'd get on the wrong elevator going the wrong direction. When I finally got on the right elevator, I'd get off on the wrong floor. And somewhere I had read that they had very recently discovered in autopsies of people with Alzheimer's disease that they had aluminum deposits in their brains, and they were trying to figure out where this aluminum came from. They thought suppositories have aluminum in them, aluminum cooking ware, a lot of juices are in aluminum cans, and so I decided maybe the aluminum hydroxide was making me senile, so I started pouring it down the sink in the room there in the hospital, and my mental clarity returned to the point that anyway my IQ became high enough where once again I could operate elevators. I'm not sure there wasn't some permanent damage, because yesterday, there's all examples every day. Yesterday I signed some guy's Principia Discordia and I wrote the inscription. I forgot to sign my name. If he's around, I'll be glad to, it wasn't intentional, I'll be glad to sign my name. I forgot who Adam, registered in my mind who Adam was when I saw the apocalypse culture sitting in front of him. And when we were out in the hall afterwards talking, I asked him what his thing was, and he told me he was publisher of Apocalypse Culture. And I had known that 5 minutes earlier. So anyway, when I checked into a neighborhood dialysis center, the nurse asked me if I was on any medication, and I said, well, I'm supposed to be taking aluminum hydroxide. And I told her the same story I just told you. And she said, we've discovered the same thing. And they had 100 patients at that center. She said, we stopped giving aluminum hydroxide to our patients because it was disorienting. And I say this, this is a digression, but I went into it because it's very important. All these milky, chalky, white substances you get over the counter for overacid stomach have aluminum hydroxide in them. Don't take them. The last thing the world needs is a bunch of dumb paranoids. As for my paranoia about conspiracies, a funny thing happened. As soon as I was diagnosed as a paranoid, the relentless persecution that I've been experiencing since August of 1975 relented enormously. So now that I'm a paranoid, I no longer have delusions of persecution. Unwilling to let well enough alone, though, I volunteered to go into therapy because I said, well, you know, there's so much documentation in my case that I can overwhelm my shrink and prove to her that I'm really being persecuted, and then nobody will ever be able to doubt my sanity again as long as I live. So I was going to convince her that I wasn't paranoid. It turned out this woman had a very brief attention span. One day, for example, I told her that, well, I really didn't think my sex life was relevant, but I would discuss it with her because otherwise I knew she would interpret that as resistance on my part. And immediately, in order to sum up what I had said, she said, you didn't want to discuss sex with me because you thought I would be resistant. Those were her exact words. And I thought, God, this bimbo is stupider than I think, or I'm stupid, and she's trying to tell me something, you know, my male ego. And so I set up a few travelers. She was stupider than I thought. What I found out was that you can be perfectly functional and successful, and you can be as happy as bizarre circumstances. Oh yeah, the other reason I was sure that she wasn't very smart was because she decided that I was brilliant. She was always telling me how brilliant I was. And that's the thing, see? You can be functional and successful and all this if you're brilliant. If you're a brilliant paranoid, then you can disguise the symptoms. You know? You can have a sense of humor, even though paranoids don't usually have a sense of humor. Paranoia is supposed to be based on fears of one's own latent homosexuality. I'm bisexual. I don't know how I never asked to explain how I could be paranoid in those terms. One day, however, during one of our discussions, she said, in so many words, I really thought I was getting someplace. She said, Kerry, I don't think you're paranoid, and I don't think you're schizophrenic. And then in the next breath, she said, however, your thought patterns are atypical. Well, putting aside whether typical thought patterns are healthy thought patterns, I said to her, what are atypical thought patterns? And she said, when you talk about German breeding experiments and surveillance devices and conspiracies, that is paranoid ideation. And I said, but such things exist. And she said, I know. Keep in mind which one of us was a schizophrenic in this discussion. Of course, a real paranoid would at that point have gotten suspicious of his doctor and probably of the entire psychiatric profession. Obviously, some of those real paranoids are pretty sharp. So I discovered some material on the history of psychiatric association. Before Hitler gave the whole subject a bad name, there was a movement, there were even advertisements for it in Emma Goldman's magazine, Mother Earth. It was called the eugenic movement. And their purpose was to breed better human beings the same way we breed dogs and horses. And it was quite respectable among numerous intellectuals. A lot of Darwinists and so on and so forth were very much into eugenics. According to the ideology of that movement, crossing a mentally ill person with a mentally healthy person would probably result in mentally ill offspring. So one of their big agendas was to sterilize the mentally ill. It came to pass that in Great Britain, the eugenics movement was headed by a woman or actually an activist in the eugenics movement, was a woman named Evelyn Fox, and she founded, for the purposes of advancing eugenics, agenda, the National Council for Mental Hygiene. Now, my shrink was a young woman, still in training, obviously took on faith everything she was told at Emory Medical School. In effect, she was in her way only following orders. Whoever originated those rules for diagnosis, however, evidently decided that anyone who talks about German breeding experiments is paranoid. According to Bernard Schreiber, in The Men Behind Hitler, the mental hygiene movement grew strongly from the eugenic movement of whatever country they were in. He goes on to say, sterilization and euthanasia were not the ideas of the Nazis and never had been. They were the ideas which were supported and promoted throughout the whole world by groups with a strong interest in the development of mental hygiene. Germany, however, was the only country in which the political climate allowed materialization of the final goal of sterilization and euthanasia of the mentally disturbed. Tiergarten 4 in Berlin was the headquarters of the Nazi Mercy Death Administration. And so the program was called T4. Mental hospitals were turned into schools for murder, complete with the same kinds of death chambers that would later exterminate Jews in death camps, that were also under the direction of T4. After the war, because of the bad reputation given it by the Nazis, the eugenic, sterilization, and euthanasia movement underwent a worldwide whitewashing. Out of this emerged first the British National Association of Mental Health and then the World Federation of Mental Health. A vice president of the Third International Congress of Mental Health, convened in 1948, was Dr. Carl Gustav Jung. I am myself, in many respects, a Jungian. I have great respect for many of the theories, the psychoanalytic theories that Jung advanced. However, Jung was co-editor of the Journal for Psychotherapy up until that time with M.H. Goring, Dr. M.H. Goring, who was a cousin of Hermann Goring of the Third Reich. I used to think that bumper sticker, support mental health or I'll kill you, was a joke. Then I was in California being interviewed by Oliver Stone, and I met John Stockwell, the renegade CIA agent. And I happened to notice that he had a mustache just like Alan Dulles. And I said, I see you've got that Alan Dulles mustache. And he said, yeah, he and I were good friends. And I said, oh, is that right? I said, I read a biography of Dulles. And I said, I noticed in there that when he was in Switzerland negotiating Operation Sunrise, trying to negotiate a separate peace with the SS is basically what it amounted to. Kim Philby sabotaged it. When that was going on, where he was talking to Wolf and Walter Schellenberg, and I forget who all else of the SS, trying to mitigate the unconditional surrender demands that the U.S. had made, his principal assistant was named Mary Bancroft, and she was in therapy there in Switzerland with Carl Gustav Jung. And I said, you know what I think happened, John? I said, I think when Philby sabotaged, see what they were doing, they were sending all this stuff. They thought they were sending it to Roosevelt and Truman about, we got these Nazis, they want to surrender, but they wanted certain conditions and so on and so forth. They weren't getting any answers. Well, it turned out Kim Philby in the London office was sending all this stuff to Stalin instead. So that might be one of the things that started the Cold War, in addition to the fact that General Galen had a monopoly on all intelligence that was supplied to the CIA about the Soviet Union. And would not tell the CIA who the members of his organization were, and was successful in not telling them that, even though they were financing his organization the whole time. And it was finally, Army intelligence had made a study of the Galen organization. However, they did not tell, it was so secret, they didn't want the CIA to know that they were infiltrating a CIA organization to find out what was going on, so they never told the CIA what their findings were. It came out under Freedom of Information, finally. And predictably, the Galen organization was riddled both with Bolshevik and Nazis of all types. It was just, it was really a wild organization. Anyway, Jung basically has been many times accused of being a Nazi, and many people say that he wasn't a Nazi. He was not a Hitler Nazi. Lyndon LaRouche is very good about pointing this out. He was not, neither was Dulles. Neither one of them were Hitler Nazis. They both thought Hitler was a buffoon because they lost the war, for one thing. Particularly in Galen's case, the losing of the war. And the idea here, as far as I can tell, was that the problem with Nazism was the patriarchy aspect of it. The father was such a strong figure in the German family unit that the German people wanted this male father figure to identify with, and that otherwise Nazism was pretty much a good idea. It dealt with a lot the collective unconscious and all that, and so on and so forth. So they formed, I said to Stockwell, I think they formed a secret society at that point. And talking, somebody mentioned this thing about finding the principles behind conspiracies and so on and so forth. I think one principle is that whenever negotiations of any kind break down, almost always a secret society is formed to carry out the goals of the negotiations by the people that very much wanted the negotiations to succeed. And I told Stockwell I thought that's what happened here, and he looked at me and he said, "That's exactly what happened. Exactly." According to, I'm sorry, numerous links with psychiatry due to its eugenic origins position these warmed over Nazis, ideally for purposes of discrediting those who brought German breeding experiments to public attention. Fortunately, even psychiatry is not a monolithic conspiracy, and the diagnosis of paranoia has its critics. Dr. Claude Steiner, he's an associate of Eric Berne. He's also written a couple of books about what he calls radical psychiatry. I highly recommend his work. He also is responsible for my favorite quotation about paranoia. Paranoia is heightened awareness. Most people are persecuted beyond their wildest delusions. No less respect than an authority than Dr. Abraham Maslow wrote in The Farther Reaches of Human Nature, there is still another psychological process that I have run across in my explorations of failure to actualize the self. This evasion of growth can also be set in motion by a fear of paranoia. That's what kept me from looking into the Warren Commission stuff and into the Kennedy assassination for 13 years. I was afraid that if I became suspicious about all this stuff, I'd become paranoid. And I thought that everybody who was suspicious about it probably, I was always looking for little telltale signs of their mental health. I want to quote to the best of my memory something that Stan Jamison, known as Coleman Raw in the Discordian Society, said to me in a letter in 1976. He said, "Paranoia is a giant step in the direction of mental health, because once somebody becomes paranoid, they will not stop until they uncover every last shred of truth." Jameson, incidentally, was the only person who's ever given me a logical answer of why the crude Oswald impersonations. He claimed to have been one of the assassins. He wrote me letters about why we fascists assassinated Kennedy. He said that that was designed, there were lower level people in the conspiracy who wanted to establish that it was a conspiracy without the knowledge of the people they were working for. So they went out and did these crude Oswald. They had a bald-headed Oswald, a fat Oswald, an Oswald who drove a car that Oswald didn't drive. That the idea behind this was so that when Oswald became well known, because they knew he was going to be framed for it, that there'd be all these weird little things that they'd have to account for, and that they couldn't and they didn't. They just brushed them aside. So from now on, when anybody tells me I'm crazy, I just say, well, that's one thing I know. Tell me something I don't know. Many people have seen the movie or read the book, probably, The Cane Mutiny. Anybody here seen that movie? All right. For those of you who haven't, Humphrey Bogart played, I believe his name was Captain Queeg. At least I remember that's what they called him in the Mad Magazine satire. I think that was also his name in the movie. Anyway, he had a habit of clicking these little steel marbles together, and his favorite expression was, "I kid you not." And he was the captain of the ship, the Cane. And one night he woke up the ship's crew and invited them all down into the ship's commissary, and he had some sand there, and he was putting sand in ice cream containers, and he proving that some of the ice cream was missing, that somebody had stolen some ice cream. The Mad Magazine version, they say, "Captain Queeg, you don't mean you woke us up in the middle of the night just to tell us that some ice cream was missing?" He says, "No, I thought I'd invite you all down for a dish of sand." Anyway, so the crew in the movie, basically, the story is they decide Captain Queeg's going to lose his steel marbles pretty soon, and he's captain of the ship, so that they're justified in mutinying because he's paranoid. And that was the first time I ever heard the word paranoid. And then in the court-martial, he is, in fact, they are vindicated. They do decide that Captain Queeg, the psychiatrist says, yes, Captain Queeg is paranoid. So we paranoids have a way with words, and so before all this came up a few years ago, I wrote this little poem, with which I'm going to conclude, and we can open up the discussion. See the flower when I don't see the cloud. Say I should whisper when all I want is to scream. Which one of you thieves stole my ice cream? Alas for poor Queeg, we all knew him well. They hatched that poor booby, crazy as hell. There's only one thing that lurks in my mind. Steal my ice cream, I'm sure in a bind. Thank you. Basically, I'm interested in how do we deal with this problem? Yeah, Mr. Smith. Glenn Duncan told me that Oswald and Marina's plane stopped in Atlanta on their way to Dallas from the Soviet Union. I wasn't in Atlanta at the time, thank God. Because I've been accused of meeting with Oswald since knowing him in the Marines on a number of occasions, and to the best of my knowledge, I didn't. I finally figured out who the guy was in New Orleans that Barbara Reed was claiming was Oswald. But all I know is that they made a stopover in Atlanta. What that means, I don't know, if anything. Wordsley.
I saw the current affairs thing, the video room of Sarah yesterday. I was wondering, were you really sincerely that angry at Kennedy?
Oh, hell yes. I was into Ayn Rand. Kennedy was Wesley Mooch. He was destroying the economy of the whole world. He was plunging the whole world into starvation by persecuting big business. I was so naive and so clever. Yeah, I thought big business was America's persecuted minority, and I was very mad at him for picking on U.S. Steel. I also was very angry over the Katanga massacre. I still think that was an abomination, particularly since when Moise Tshombe wanted to come into the country, Kennedy wouldn't let him. He was the head of the Katanga rebels that were massacred when all that happened with UN's support and with Kennedy's support. Kennedy wouldn't even talk to the guy, wouldn't even give him a visa to come into the country and present his case. I was furious about that.
But have you seen the final edit of the show?
Yeah, I saw it. And what I said was accurate. The names I mentioned were Slim Brooks and Howard Hunt that they bleeped out. I'm almost certain the guy I was talking to in New Orleans about assassinating Kennedy was Howard Hunt. He looked like him.
That was later one of Nixon's buddies?
What?
Well, wasn't he later one of Nixon's aides from Watergate?
Yeah, he was very Watergate burglar, yeah. And it was like, that's when I realized that I was involved. I mean, my God, these guys are just like the weird Nazi I was talking to in New Orleans that I thought was nuts. He repeated himself all the time because there was stuff he wanted to be remembered. Basically, what they were doing with me, they were trying to frame somebody. They were using another name of a guy named Gary Kirsten, who evidently was involved in conspiracy between H.L. Hunt and Howard Hunt to escalate the war in Vietnam. And the bet was that if I named him to the Warren Commission, that would blow his cover, and then they'd invade Cuba instead of Vietnam. And if I didn't name him, then they'd invade Vietnam instead of Cuba. But it was like, it was a way of resolving a dispute, best I can tell. And yes, Stephanie. That possibility has been suggested, and brother-in-law very often mentioned to me, one of the things he kept mentioning over and over, which convinced me he was senile, because it didn't seem relevant to me at the time. Anyway, that's also, so much of the stuff seemed irrelevant. He said, Leviticus 16, chapter 16 of Leviticus, he says, you know, they take 2 goats, and they sacrifice one of them, and they put the sins of the tribe on the other goat and let him go in the wilderness. And that's the escape goat. And that's where our term scapegoat comes from. He says there are certain tribal secret societies that practice rituals like that. I think Oswald was the goat that was, and they drew lots. Aaron would draw lots to decide which goat to sacrifice and which goat not to sacrifice. Interestingly enough, Slim Brooks, who I think was Jerry Milton's Brooks, an ex-Minuteman working for Guy Bannister, I knew him as Slim Brooks. Slim's Discordia name was Aaron Emanuel Viking I. So perhaps he's the guy who drew the lot and decided which of us to shoot. Yeah.
Question. You knew Oswald, as a person. If you were a novelist, or if you were...
I was a novelist. Okay. I wrote a novel about him, yeah.
For the purposes of this discussion, could you characterize him, the adjectives that you'd use to describe him, how he behaved,
right.
As a person?
Yeah.
Well,
he was, in retrospect, I realized he was very hip about the intelligence community, and I wasn't at the time. But one day I was arguing with Nelson Delgado, and at that time I was a humanist. I was into Corliss Lamont, who was billed as a humanist and a friend of the Soviet Union. And his disagreement with communism was the ambiguous attitude toward democracy, and I agreed with him about that. And I had said to Delgado a few days before meeting Oswald in an argument that I thought the best religion was humanism. When I met Oswald, the first thing he said to me, and I, of course, would not have made the connection then, didn't until quite recently, they said, here's Oswald, here's Thornley, you're both atheists, we thought you'd like to meet each other. And Oswald said, yes, he says, I think the best religion is communism. Now, I think what he was telling me was that he thought Corliss Lamont's humanism was communism, which in many ways it was. I don't know that for a fact, but that appears to me that he was talking in double entendres at the time. He was a quiet guy. He read a lot of books. Very few people in the Marine Corps, even in the Marine Air Wing, read books except sex books and detective stories, and those of us who did were suspected of possibly being gay, or we were readers, it was like in Brave New World. We were subversive just because we read books. I remember I was reading a book on Lenin once, and some sergeant says, I don't know about you sometimes, Thornley. Just, well, know thine enemy and all this. He didn't buy it, but it's like, and Oswald, was, to top that off, was subscribing to some Russian newspaper. In my Warren Report testimony, I said it was Pravda. Evidently it wasn't. It was just some Russian newspaper of some kind. And, but the thing that impressed me about Oswald, Jim Garrison swore up and down every time he ever wrote about me that I portrayed Oswald as a communist. If you read my Warren Report testimony, you'll see that I said I didn't think, at that time, until he went to Russia, I never thought he was serious, because he always had a little smile on his face when he said this stuff. It was always like he knew some secret, and you'll notice in the last days of the Kennedy assassination, and the Illuminatus trilogy deals with this, that were they having, aiming the gun out the book depository, and then somebody else shoots Kennedy, and they say that's what he was smiling about. He knew something that nobody else knew. But whatever it was, it's like he was always that way. He always had this little secretive smile on his face, and so I thought he was just, he was. I had a friend that I knew who one day went to high school in a Nazi uniform, and from then on went around telling everybody he was a Nazi, and nobody, up until then he hadn't been a Nazi, nobody knew whether he was serious or not. And I figured Oswald was a communist variation of somewhat the same thing. He always was making jokes about his communism and this, that, and the other thing. And one guy mentions in the Warren Report, he had a record called Russian Fireworks, and when he'd play it, and Oswald would hear him playing it, he'd come over to his hut and stick his head in his cubicle and say, "Comrade, you called?" And that was Oswald. It was like the outfit clown the class clown being accused of assassinating the president. I was Adam.
What are your reflections on appearing in front of the board?
What?
As an organization, what are your reflections on your experience appearing in front of
Oh, I was their fair-haired lad. I was providing just what they wanted to hear. One of the points people make, they say, Kerry's test, even Ramparts magazine said this when they wrote a thing about me that they didn't publish, but the introduction to the article that I'd written for them was, unlike most of the Warren Report witnesses, Kerry's testimony was coherent and all this, and well, the reason was because they called me back the next day and they let me go through my court transcript and correct all the misspellings and mispronunciation, all the mistranscriptions. They didn't do that with most people. And Jenner just stroked my ego all the way through it. An attorney said that they would have thrown that out in a courtroom because at one point he said, "I'm searching for motivation." And I said, "Oh, you want to know why I think he killed Kennedy? All right." I was obviously just exactly what they wanted at the time.
I heard an interview that you did on the radio once, and you mentioned something about Charles de Gaulle and
Yeah.
his involvement.
Charles de Gaulle is my Aristotle Onassis. I am Charles de Gaulle what Stephanie is to Aristotle. This had occurred to me a number of years ago. And the thing is, who took over I've got a thing about it up here. It's my only original contribution to the assassination material, besides my personal experiences. It occurred to me that who took over the Vietnam War for the French? Whose political philosophy did Henry Kissinger's political philosophy most resemble? I was a great admirer of Charles de Gaulle at the time of my discussions with brother-in-law, and we used to talk about him. And he mentioned going to as did Maurice Brooks Gatlin. I think they were the same guy. I think Maurice Brooks Gatlin was another cover that Hunt was using. His name was Maurice Brooks Gatlin Sr., and he was a legal advisor to Guy Bannister. It'd be interesting to find out if there is a Maurice Brooks Gatlin Jr. anywhere, because I'll bet there isn't. Anyway, Maurice Brooks Gatlin Sr. and the guy that I was talking to, who said his name was Gary Kirsten, that I think was Howard Hunt, went to France with some money for some generals that were plotting to overthrow de Gaulle, or knew about it. He knew about it before this guy knew about it. Gatlin did it. According to Murrow's book, Betrayal, according to any book that mentions Maurice Brooks Gatlin, Turner's Rampart, 1968 Rampart magazine article where he interviews Jerry Milton Brooks. And Milton Brooks tells him about this mentor of his called Gatlin that sounds to me very much like the relationship between Slim and brother-in-law. Anyway, Gatlin got some money from Guy Bannister and went to these generals who were plotting to overthrow de Gaulle and told them that it was from the CIA. It was actually from the FBI, probably, or from Pepsi Cola. It was involved in this stuff, both Coke and Pepsi. If you want to get rich, go into soft drinks. These people have so much money that they play with the world with it, you know. Anyway, Walter Cronkite once actually gave a program where he said the whole world is divided between Pepsi and Coke. You know, like Palestinians are in Pepsi, and Israel is into Coca-Cola, and they actually shoot bullet holes in the Coke and Pepsi signs in the Middle East because they're so connected with the enemy to them. Anyhow, this money, wherever it came from, was taken to these generals, and I believe, and this is purely speculation, I believe that de Gaulle was tipped off about it on purpose. And I believe Nixon and Hunt and J. Edgar Hoover and General Galen were the ones who got the idea. And what they did was they made de Gaulle paranoid about Kennedy. They convinced de Gaulle that Kennedy was trying to kill him, because these generals had attempted to assassinate de Gaulle on a number of occasions. And I believe de Gaulle was a member of the Royal Archmasons. And my understanding is that when you go after one Royal Archmason, they all come after you. And so it was very easy for de Gaulle and the French Royal Archmasons to turn the assassination around. And I have a lot of respect for the Royal Archmasons. I'm not putting them down. Jean-Paul Sartre was, I am told, a Grand Master of the Royal Archmasons. However, I do believe they were involved in the Kennedy assassination on one of the most witting levels, besides Hoover and Hunt and Nixon and that crowd. So that's what I think happened. I don't know. I could not prove it to them.
I've got two questions. One is, when is your nonfiction manuscript about your Kennedy era experiences going to be published, or is it possible to buy Xerox copies?
Well, I'd be glad to say a Xerox copy. Here's this story. There was a guy named Robert L. Dry out in California that I met one day when I was hitchhiking in 1981. He told me he would publish it. I sent it to him. He kept it for a long time, sent it back, never published it. Then there's a guy named William Cutler, who was a War Report critic up in Boston. He came down to Atlanta to see me for an enormous physical resemblance to a fraternity brother of mine whose name was Gordy, who I now think was Gordon Novell, and is best known for exposing Gordon Novell as the Umbrella Man in Dealey Plaza. Whether he was or not, I don't know. Cutler was all gung-ho about publishing it, and took the manuscript with him, went back and sent me $200, and then started writing me letters that I would send him a letter, and he would send me an answer that didn't seem to have anything to do with anything I'd said. The rumor I heard was that he'd been threatened with brain damage if he published it. I don't know whether that's true or not.
But you would be willing to sell like Xerox copies?
Oh, hell yes. I've been doing that for years just to make sure it cannot be suppressed. Yeah.
My next question is, I read somewhere in reading about one of your experiences that at sometime in the mid-late 60s, you wound up working, I believe it was as a doorman, I can't remember what it said, but working
Yes.
in an apartment building where Johnny Roselli lived, and
Yeah.
I wondered if you ever knew or met Roselli.
Yeah, well, another interesting thing about Johnny Roselli is his girlfriend's name was Jewel Switzer. And that's, the Switzers are my mother's maiden name, as I mentioned earlier, the ones I think are connected with the Templars. I found that out recently reading a biography of Jimmy the Weasel. I was working in Glen Towers apartment building. It's hard for me to believe that I got this job as a result of a conspiracy. I passed out resumes. However, there was one possibility. I passed out resumes all through the area where I was living, which was in Culver City, right near Beverly Glen, California, to all the high-rise apartment building, because I worked as a desk clerk in a high-rise apartment building before. And I think it was my wife's suggestion, and at that time she was a technical writer for Hughes Aircraft, which is why we were living in Culver City, incidentally. All right, so anyhow, I got a job at Beverly Glen. And it was a condo type thing where these people bought these apartments in the building. Mona Freeman lived there. She lived on the top floor. She was an actress. She was always being jilted by one gigolo after another, being taken advantage of by men. And was frequently in tears. There was some doctor who'd been an anesthetologist, and he used to get up, Alpert was his name, he used to get up every morning at 9 o'clock and go to the golf course. He's retired now, and come back at 5 o'clock every night. And I thought, well, my God, why, if you're rich and retired and all that, it's just like going to work, And it was like nobody in that building seemed to be enjoying life except Johnny Roselli. And I really liked him for that reason. You know, he just seemed to be having a good time with his money. And he was very, when I knew him, he'd become much more refined and polished than he was in his younger days when he was a torpedo over the mafia. He was a mafia don. He was the don of Las Vegas, and he was very, very, I was an old, white-haired, very distinguished Italian gentleman, very friendly. And he would come in with a starlet under each arm some nights and stuff like that. I just thought that was great, you know. And the FBI would go through his car every so often. And we would go down, we had a microphone down in the garage underneath the building, and we'd hear somebody going through cars, and our job was to go down there and see who it was. And every so often, we'd catch these two guys in suits going through Johnny Rosselli's car, and we'd say, "Who are you?" And they'd produce FBI credentials, and we'd say, "Do you have a search warrant?" And they'd say, "No." And we'd say, "Well, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." And they'd say, "We understand," and they'd go. And so one night, Johnny came in, and I was sitting at the desk, and the guys that had been on the day shift said, "We caught the feds going through Johnny Rosselli's car again today." And so when he came in that night, I said, "Oh, by the way, Mr. Rosselli, the FBI was going through your car again today." And he said, "They don't scare me." And it was kind of a toothy, forced grin, but it was like, he says, "They don't scare me." He says, "They're so stupid." And he says, "But you know who's really stupid is the CIA." And I said, "Oh, yeah?" I said, "You know, tell me about it." He said, "Well, they're so stupid they shot their own president. Trying to either trying to get some bookie or for trying to get some bookie. I never figured out which, but it was one or the other." And then he took me up to his apartment and he showed me a hole in his wall where he'd found a bugging device and had stuffed napkins into it. And he loaned me a copy of The Invisible Government by Weiss with a chapter about the raid on the ammunition dump in Hammond, Louisiana that Gordon Novell was involved in, and told me to read it. So I read it, and I thought, well, what's this got to do with anything? You know, gave it back to him. Long before I began to suspect that I had actually known Gordon Novell. But see, that was one of the things Garrison said. He says, "You and Gordon Novell went to the University of Southern California the same year." I said, "Yeah, well, so did 73,000 other students." So, but I did have a fraternity brother whose name was Gordy. And I do believe that one day they asked him what his last name was. He pronounced it Novel. He said, "Novel." And they said, "What kind of name is that?" He said, "A Hungarian name." So I'm almost certain that in addition to all these other people I met in New Orleans that were involved in the assassination, I also knew Gordon Novell, who was a shadowy suspect in the Gordon. So I guess Johnny Rosselli maybe thought I remembered Gordon Novell, maybe he was trying to tell me something, but I don't know.
About what year was that?
That was probably 1966. I'm certain it was 66, as a matter of fact.
Did Rosselli speak with an accent?
No, oh no. That was one of the only conversations we ever had. It was strange that the first thing he should mention to me, and I said, "I knew Oswald." I said, "That's interesting because I knew Oswald," or something like that. And I think, I'm not certain, but I seem to recall that he said, "Yeah, I knew him, he was a loser."
Did he have any kind of a regional American accent, like a New York accent or a Southern accent?
No, I'm a Californian, he was a Californian. I probably wouldn't have noticed an accent. It didn't seem to me like he had any accent at all.
And Oswald, did he speak with an accent?
He had no accent either. He didn't even have a Texas accent, as I remembered. I didn't know he was from Texas until it came out in the papers.
You said that at the Warren Commission hearing, they allowed you to read over the transcripts.
Yes, my transcript.
Why do you think
They didn't allow the other witnesses. So the other witnesses sounded like that because they needed to establish motivation for why Oswald shot Kennedy. And no self-respecting shrink or anybody else pretended to know why. And so the next best thing was an unpublished novelist who'd written a book about Oswald before the assassination. So it was like, they asked me, and I said, "Yeah, I think Oswald was paranoid and this, that, and the other thing," and they quoted it in the Warren report. But it was to establish motivation for an otherwise inexplicable act. Why the hell did he shoot, you know, if he had shot Kennedy, if he wasn't standing on the front steps of the book depository 2 seconds before the shot were fired, and wasn't on the first floor when they were fired, or the second floor, why the hell would he have done it? My explanation was the only one they had, so they used it. Any more questions? Anybody want to say anything about anything? All right, I guess that's it. Thank you very much. Flyers up here that describe the synopsis.